So welcome back to another episode of the BioHub. Today, we're delighted to welcome a visionary leader in the biotech space in Abby Jenkins. Abby is currently the CEO of a stealth mode company, and prior to that, she was the president and CEO of Gamida Cell, where she steered the company through an FDA approval. Prior to that, Abby held pivotal leadership roles at Lindra Therapeutics, Emergent Biosolutions, Equinox Pharmaceuticals, Pfizer, and MedImmune. She now brings her expertise to the boards of both Aquestic Therapeutics and Zortex Therapeutics, and earned a spot amongst Pharma Voice's 100 most inspiring leaders. So Abby, thanks so much for coming on. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me, Sean.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So look, let's start off with your story. So what first got you interested in biotech, and how did your path lead you from science to executive leadership?
Well, like many people in the industry, I got my start in big pharma, working at Pfizer. Back in the heyday of Pfizer, I was actually a part of the launch of Viagra back in 1998. And I really enjoyed my time at Pfizer. Big pharma is a great training ground, really teaching you the business. You get to learn the industry from the front lines, and they invest a lot in building skills in their employees. And they also offer a lot in terms of bureaucracy and politics and a slower pace. So about 8 years into my pharmaceutical career, I got recruited to a company called MedImmune, which is now absorbed into AstraZeneca. But at the time, MedImmune was a up and coming biotech. And it was my first biotech. And at the time, MedImmune was a commercial stage biotech, which a lot of biotechs get acquired before they reach that stage. But MedImmune was a proper biotech, and they were planning to launch a new product, and they were looking to grow their existing portfolio. So it was an exciting time to go to MedImmune and be a part of that transformation. It was definitely a big change going from big pharma to a biotech company, less structure, less rigor, at least at the time, but it was a lot of white space. You could really build things from scratch, and you could move so much faster at a small company. And at the time, MedImmune wasn't even, now when I think about biotech, I think about, 10 people, 20 people, 60 people. At the time, I was going from a company that had 150,000 global employees at Pfizer at the time to about 1,500 at MedImmune. So it felt very tiny, but by biotech standards, it was a big biotech. And so there was a lot of opportunity to build things and to really, really try on, wear a lot of hats. I think other people talk about that when you go from big pharma, you tend to be a specialist. When you go to biotech, you end up wearing a lot of hats. And you get to learn a lot of new things and move really quickly. So once I got a taste of that biotech experience, then I just wanted to go earlier and earlier and smaller and smaller and scrappier and scrappier. I moved from MedImmune ultimately to Relipsa, which felt like a real startup. It had about 60 people when I joined. A colleague and I, actually from Pfizer, we were the first two commercial employees, and we built that commercial team up to about 256 people, and we launched that product. It was amazing to take a company and have its first product that gets to market, which I'd never done up to that point. And then I moved to a company called Equinox, which was at a phase 2 point, moving into phase 3. So earlier in the journey, whereas Relipsa had been pre-commercial, but post phase 3. And then ultimately just got earlier and earlier, fast forward a few companies later to where I am now, which is the earliest of all of the startups, 3 of us doing foundational fundraising with preclinical science. So I've just, really loved that early startup experience.
Nice. And just onto this new venture that you've got, without giving too much away, can you tell us about what you're building and what motivated you to take this on?
Sure. I think, my last company that I was at was called Gamida Cell. Gamida Cell was a company that was bringing the first pharmaceutical grade stem cell transplant to market, which was something that was a one-time curative potentially life-saving treatment for patients with blood cancers. And that was incredibly meaningful because essentially it's a precision medicine, patient for patient, that the medicine you're making has the potential to save that person's life, which is just incredibly, incredible sense of purpose and responsibility to deliver that product to patients, which set an incredibly high bar for what I was looking for in my next company. Really wanted something that could inspire that same sense of purpose and responsibility. So I was, in this case, looking for an even earlier stage company. Gamida Cell was pre-commercial, so another opportunity to take a company in that clinical to commercial transition, bring their first product to market, but really wanted to get even earlier in the startup journey, and was looking for an early stage company with something truly transformative to make a difference for patients, with a great team that I wanted to work with. And with this new stealth mode company, I've found all of that here. Our science is based on restoring the body's native tumor suppressor system in a simple and novel way that has the potential to be first in class. You could think of it like insulin for a type 1 diabetic patient, that in all of us every day, if we don't have type 1 diabetes, we are going around producing our own insulin. If we develop type 1 diabetes, then we need to receive exogenous insulin. In patients with solid tumors, like patients with ovarian cancer, you get a loss of this gene function, which enables the tumors to grow. And we believe that we can deliver an exogenous protein that would restore that native tumor suppression function. Our preclinical data shows that not only a halting tumor development, but actual shrinkage, 93% reduction in the tumor size. And so certain cancers, like ovarian cancer, still have very high mortality rates, despite recent advances in cancer treatment. With ovarian cancer, there's only a 50% 5-year survival rate, even with all of the advancements that have happened in the recent past. And this population is often studied as a kind of add-on to other cancers. Like if we're studying lung cancer or colon cancer, sure, throw some ovarian cancer patients in there. And I think that's one of the things that has really hindered development and advancement for patients with certain solid tumors like ovarian cancer. So in this case, we believe that for patients with ovarian cancer, there's actually the loss of this gene function that is creating the cancer. And that if we can restore that function, we believe that we could improve survival by at least 50% from where it is today. So really an opportunity to make a big difference and have a transformative therapy, if we can raise the money to get into the clinic and really test this out in here.
Nice, exciting. You've been an advocate for early stage science. Why is that so important to you, and how do you think it impacts the future of the biotech ecosystem?
I think it's essential to maintaining a thriving biopharma ecosystem, especially here in the US. US companies have been the substrate for most of the life-changing blockbuster medicines of our time. And often it's little biotech companies that make those game-changing, transformative therapies that end up getting acquired by bigger pharmaceutical companies that enable them to be more accessible to more patients because they can put more infrastructure and resources against the medicines. But we all know that about 9 out of 10 drugs fail, that the science is hard. You know, clinical trials, especially with novel mechanisms and novel modalities, it's hard to know going in exactly how to design those trials and ensure that you not only show a clinical benefit with a good safety profile, but have what regulators will require to get a drug ultimately approved. So that means that we've got to be taking a lot of shots on goal in order to get a few of them, 1 out of 10, 10% that are going to make it ultimately to the patients that need them. And, I think when you think about 9 out of 10 things failing, you focus on the failure and the cost of that failure. But many of the breakthroughs ultimately have come from the failures that we learn through the science that doesn't work just as much as we learn through the science that does work. I mentioned that I got my start in the industry of being a part of the launch expansion for Viagra. Viagra is an excellent example of success by failure, as that drug was originally developed as a treatment for angina, that ultimately was approved for erectile dysfunction. So I think in that way, that's just an example where there it's not just getting to the 1 out of 10 who succeeds, but it's everything that we learn through the pursuit of science and pushing the boundaries and really looking for novel and better treatments across disease states that we thrive in this industry. So we can't lose our passion. We can't lose the quest for scientific advancement. And we can't forget, of the important role that the US plays in driving that engine. If you needed a bottom line reason on why we need to fuel this, there is an economic aspect to it in that if there are less investments in early companies and emerging technologies, ultimately, if we fast forward, maybe not 2 years from now or 5 years from now, but 10 years from now, if we don't invest in this, we won't have the opportunities for M&A, and we won't be able to drive that economic engine that is the biopharmaceutical industry in the future.
Nice. And just looking back at your time at Gamida Cell, what were some of the key lessons you learned from both some of the successes and the setbacks that you had there?
I think three of the key lessons that I learned from that experience, and that was my first CEO experience. It was a public company at a time where we were under some financial pressure against the backdrop of a very challenging financial landscape and fundraising landscape. So it was certainly a unique time to be trying to launch a cell therapy. We were also one of the first companies that launched a cell therapy without having been acquired. So we were very exposed. We weren't buried under the P&L of a bigger revenue generating portfolio. So I think three lessons I learned. Number one, and this one I feel like Gamida Cell didn't have to teach me, but because I've learned it through my 25 years, largely on the commercial and business and business development side of the business, that number one, commercial planning needs to be hand in hand with clinical and regulatory development planning. Number two, the unique cost structure that is cell and gene therapy versus other modalities and other types of products, especially small molecules and biologics. And then the importance of resilience, how important that skill is almost above all others if you're going to be in the biotech industry for the long term. So if I take each one of these, the commercial planning and prep, I would say to the degree you're introducing a therapy that is disruptive, and this is true whether you're in the oral small molecule primary care space or you're all the way at the other end of the spectrum in these advanced cell and gene therapies, the more disruptive that therapy is going to be to how healthcare providers are practicing today, the more you have to invest financially in medical education and market development before the product comes to market to kind of get healthcare providers ready for this revolution, and then how much you're going to have to spend once the product is approved, promoting the product. And I think, a lot of people may have thought, well, these cell and gene therapies, especially if they're curative, they're kind of just going to sell themselves, and all you need to do is get them to market, and the patients will come. And unfortunately, that's not how it works out. With most of these, especially cell and gene therapies, it's not so much the reimbursement and provider landscape that's challenging, because you're talking about ultra orphan populations and curative therapies. There's a momentum there that will get those products available, accessible to patients. It's really changing healthcare provider behavior and all of the logistics that are tied to really getting your product to the patient at the moment that they need it. So I think you need to be, companies, especially those that are in disruptive spaces and cell and gene, need to be planning for even greater financial investments on the commercial side alongside clinical and regulatory spend. You've also tied with this, you've also got to be planning to carry the costs a lot longer. It used to be, you would introduce a product and very quickly become revenue generating. And especially with these complex therapies, but even if I go back to launching 10 years ago, Veltassa with Relipsa, there was already a change in the market happening where payers were putting mandatory restrictions where we won't, essentially review this product for 10 years, obviously to the degree to which your product is Medicare and Medicaid dependent. They have very slow review cycles inherently as well. So it shifted out how quickly you could become revenue generating, which ultimately shifts out your path to profitability. When you then take that into an ultra rare population with a more complicated product that requires special handling and a lot of logistics that go with it, what that means is you're going to have a much slower path to revenue, which means you have to be carrying your operating costs a lot longer getting to that point. And I think that's a huge shift in the mindset of operators at biotechs, but also a huge shift in the mindset of investors where these complex, life-saving, life-changing therapies have the potential to make a huge impact, but it's a delay in value creation and ultimately when you can see a return on that investment. So number two is just understanding that even for smaller molecules and biologics, you're going to shift out the revenue trajectory, from where it has been historically. And then number three, which was resilience above everything else. Ultimately, we found a path forward for Gamida Cell. The company went from being public to private. And that new entity has been able to aggregate a few different products under the umbrella of which Gamida Cell fits to try to improve the efficiency of that investment and that cost structure. But we had to maintain our resilience. The path to getting there was not a straightforward path. It came with so many turns and hurdles along the way. Every time we felt like we had gotten through it and now we were in the clear, there would be some new big crisis that fell on us. The most challenging of which was the fact that we had just become commercial stage toward the end of September in 2023, actually. And then we felt like, okay, we're finally turning that corner to revenue. About 5 months after we launched the product, war broke out in Israel where we manufacture the product. And you just think, wow, this is amazing. How do I make the right decisions here, the right decision for patients, for employees, for the company, for shareholders? A lot of responsibility and, not knowing, is the war going to escalate and how long is this going to last? And ultimately trying to make sure that we kept patients front and center. So it was really challenging. But through all of this, our team was amazing. Our manufacturing team in Israel was basically like, nope, we put patients first. We'll figure it out. And they did. They, found a way forward. And we ultimately found a way forward for the company. We were able to raise money even under these circumstances and extend the cash the wrong way multiple times with Gamida Cell, and ultimately found that path forward by having a private equity company take the company private. And that created a path for patient and employees and shareholders, while many of our cell therapy peers were forced to close their doors at the same time. And I can absolutely say resilience, just, figuring it out, finding a path forward was key to that.
Yeah. I think there's a growing trend of biotech companies thinking about commercialization much earlier. I know you come from a commercial background. What's your take on when it makes sense to bring in commercial strategy and start building those teams?
Well, as you said, as I mentioned earlier, it's key. I think one of the things I learned from my big pharma days, because they have so many resources, is they can dedicate commercial employees, commercial team members to new product planning or to early pipeline products to bring that commercial assessment to the table. In fact, that's typically a part of a go, no-go decision to go forward on an R&D investment based on, ultimately the potential value of that asset if it's successful going forward. So that is pretty much instilled in me, and I believe in it, because you've got to ensure that there is a market for the product, and a real market, not just kind of some degree of unmet need or something that might be a convenience play or slight improvement in the side effect profile. There's got to be something that really drives providers to use the product and ultimately patients to fill their prescriptions or to get their infusion or their injection. And it's important because, especially if you're a biotech company, when you're going out and fundraising, you're fundraising on the strength of the science. It's potential to be successful through clinical development and regulatory approval. But ultimately, they're banking on the fact that some big pharma is going to want to do M&A and create an exit for the company, or that there's going to be some potential for the company to go public, or some value creation on the stock side of things. So really, that's tied to the belief in this product's ability to make a difference in the market. And it's important to be thinking about that right from the beginning. Sometimes I've come into a company where the company's post phase 2 going into a phase 3, or even post phase 3 heading into filing, which is where Relipsa was at the time. And they're like, great, now we need you to come in and prepare for to launch this product. And you're like, oh goodness, like this is really going to be a challenge based on the dosing frequency, based on the side effect profile, based on what's likely going to be the indication for the product, based on how the clinical trials were conducted. And so you really want to be thinking about this as much as you can from the beginning. Even with the stealth mode company that I'm working with, we're looking at where the preclinical science is today and how we can ultimately design the formulation of the product and design the clinical trials to have the most meaningful impact, be able to achieve our clinical success and regulatory success, of course, but ultimately have the potential to make a meaningful difference when used for patients at the end of the day. And so ideally, you want to start that as early as possible in a drug candidate's life cycle. And that doesn't mean that a company that needs to hire a full-time commercial employee or a chief commercial officer from the beginning, but they would absolutely benefit from having a commercial consultant come in, or an advisor early in the process, to be helping them think about how they build commercial value in their development program from the beginning.
Nice. And you've been part of the biotech CEO sisterhood. I've had the pleasure of knowing a number of people who are also part of that community as well. How has that community supported you in your leadership journey? And why do you think it's important in today's biotech landscape as well?
Well, I'm so grateful to the founders, Sheila, Angie, Julia, for creating this community. It's only been around for a few years, and we're up to about 300 members now. And it's amazing to look around and have all of these sisters. They say that being a CEO is the loneliest job, and I think it is. That is very true. I also think it goes double when you're in the minority. And when you can look at a number of different metrics on the subject of how many female CEOs there are, whether you're looking at how many female CEOs are doing early fundraisers in the last 2 years, or how many public companies with a market cap of 100 million or more are, helmed by female CEOs. If you look at just biotech companies, whatever that means, and I've seen 3 different metrics on this, I can see that the number is as low as 8 to 9%. Might be as high as 18%, but so let's call that 10 to 15% of CEOs not carrying big pharma, which we know is only one. But if we say 10 to 15% of CEOs are women, okay, better than it could be. And 300 sounds like a lot on the one hand, but it really isn't close to, looking at women kind of overall in the workforce, at managerial levels, even at the C-suite level. 10 to 15% isn't equity, and it's not close to the level of representation we would expect. So, on the one side of the sisterhood, there's the community and having people that you can reach out to ask questions, to get insights, to commiserate. But the other really important aspect of the sisterhood, kind of going back to these metrics, is the advocacy and advocating for continued female leadership, equity, and not because you just want it, like we should have equity, but because the biopharma industry and our patients benefit when there's that sort of representation, especially in emerging pharma. One of the things I found interesting when I saw, the sisterhood, and I started to see my peers out there, is that a significant percentage of that 300 female CEOs is actually their founders. It's their science that they have created, that they're championing, that they're building these companies around, which is incredibly inspiring, but also must be extremely challenging when you don't have that other experience especially when most investors are looking for CEOs to be, quote unquote, proven leaders when they're backing companies, when they're building companies. And so they're, in my last year searching for my next opportunity after Gamida Cell, I heard repeatedly, well, we're looking for more of a proven leader. And when you unpack that a little bit, someone that's really raised more than $100 million in one tranche, because I'd raised $100 million, but not in one tranche, somebody that's taken a company public, that's had a big exit, like $1 billion or more. That sounds fantastic. I think that's probably a unicorn. Even looking at male CEOs, I mean, that's a pretty tall order. But when you've only got, say, 10 to 15% of female CEOs at the helm, a lot of us founders, then the odds are really against us in meeting that kind of proven leader metric. And this really makes me think more about data, of the past, which was around secondary bias when hiring managers were recruiting for managers. And, you looked at those ranks 20 years ago, and there weren't very many women represented in managerial ranks. And when they started to unpack that, they found that it's based on the criteria you're looking for, that if you're looking for people who've been able to take increasing roles of responsibility, which in the past meant moving often, or international assignments or things, those were criteria that it was harder for women to stack up against. When they started to expand the criteria, this or that, then it created more opportunities for women to step into the roles. So I think if you want to change the data, ultimately, we're going to have to change the criteria of what proven leaders work for, in terms of what proven leaders mean out there in the market. And not just for the sake of equity, not for the sake of metrics, but the data shows that companies that are run by women often outperform in terms of stock price momentum, in terms of return on equity, ability to manage downside risks in the business, and ultimately resilience in a crisis, which is things we face in biotech routinely. So it's not just good for business, but it's really good for business to have an increase in representation.
And so if you could have dinner with three people, past or present, who would it be and why?
Wow. Okay. This is a tough question. So I'm gonna go with my mom and Eve. So my mom passed away just a few months ago, and that's been really hard. I know uh, losing a loved one is hard, and I've heard from others who've lost their mother. It's particularly difficult loss to lose a mom, and she certainly taught me a lot about hard work and responsibility, gratitude, and ultimately that resilience. I can definitely say it was fostered through my mom, and I miss her every day. And I would give anything for just one more moment with her. A dinner would be fantastic. My second one is Mark Zuckerberg. So he's living. He's the only living person of my three. And really, I would just ask him, what would he do again? What would he do differently if he had to do it over again? And specifically as it relates to launching us into this social media era. In my undergraduate life, I had a dual focus and I was scientific in undergrad at Indiana University, and in graduate school at Johns Hopkins, everything was just about science. But I even took a psychology degree and turned it into a scientific degree, in that I was able to customize with a focus in neurobiology, which was kind of an up and coming field at the time. And we learned about cognitive frameworks, and I got very interested in the drivers of addiction and consequences of behaviors and implications for self-esteem and ultimately aggression later in life. So it was fascinating as I kind of peeled back this onion. And as social media was emerging, I could foresee that there were some dangers looming, especially for young people who have those networks, both cognitive and behavioral, still forming. And so I would really love to understand, now that he knows some of the consequences, which I very much believe were largely unforeseen at the time, what would he do again, and what would he do differently, if anything? Maybe his answer would be, I'm cool with it. It is what it is. But I'd love to know. And then the third one is Eve. And yes, that Eve, like as in the first woman, because I would just like to know what really happened in that garden.
Yeah. Well, look, three terrific answers there, and I'm looking forward to following your next journey and venture eventually when you come out of stealth, and I'm sure that's going to be a huge success. So, look, Abby, thanks so much for coming on and helping us out with this. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks so much for having me.
No problem.